I arrived at the church before the first pot was fully hot. The parking lot still held the chill of morning, and the sidewalk had that damp shine that made everything look clean even before anyone tried. The church building itself was modest, old brick, a white steeple that looked like it had been repainted more times than any of us could count, and windows that reflected the sky more than they showed the room inside. The soup kitchen ran on schedules that the rest of the city never seemed to notice. People came in waves, some carrying grocery bags, some carrying hunger they didn't want to admit, some carrying anger they'd learned not to show until they were outside. I wasn't in charge of anything. I never wanted to be. I was there because the food had to be served, and because in the quiet between the work and the clatter, I could remember things without letting them swallow me. When I pushed open the side door, the air was already heavy with steam. Someone had started the espresso machine for the volunteers who would pretend they needed it for energy. There were folding tables set up like a battlefield that didn't have to be named. Plastic sleeves protected the bread trays. A volunteer in a denim apron, young enough to still have the future in her face, looked at me the way you look at an extra chair you didn't order. "Morning," I said, not loud, just enough that she'd have no reason to pretend she hadn't heard. "Uh-huh," she replied, and then she turned away as if my presence was a small inconvenience to her plan. It wasn't rude, not exactly. It was worse than that. It was the kind of dismissal that didn't feel like it was happening. People like that don't think they're hurting you. They think they're saving time. I had learned a long time ago that time is a thing people can spend carelessly, and it can't be taken back. In the service, time had rules and consequences. You missed a step, you paid for it. You didn't keep your mouth shut when it mattered, you paid for it. Later in the world, time was treated like it belonged to everyone except you, like there would always be another minute to correct what you'd lost. I walked past the storage closet and found my spot near the prep table. I recognized the clatter of utensils, the familiar weight of knives, the way the stainless steel smelled when it had been washed too quickly because volunteers were always rushing toward the end of their shift instead of the start of someone else's relief. Pastor Silas Granger was there, moving slowly, talking softly to the staff. He had a gentle way of making space for other people to breathe, and I had appreciated that since the first day I'd volunteered. He didn't treat me like an oddity. He treated me like a person, which, after enough years of being looked at through a lens of suspicion, felt like mercy. "Walt," he said, and he didn't sound like he was surprised I was there. "You made it early, that's good. We'll be set faster if you're on the line." The words were simple, but they made my shoulders loosen. I nodded, and I started peeling carrots. My hands had done this kind of work before. Maybe not these exact carrots, but other tasks that required steadiness more than strength. I moved in the rhythm of repetition, the kind that turns anxiety into routine. It was strange how the mind can remember two lives at once. My fingers could be cutting vegetables while another part of me saw an altogether different table, an operations table, maps spread like cloth, hands pointing to coordinates while someone else counted down without smiling. There were days I hated the way my memories came back uninvited. There were also days I was grateful they came at all, because it meant the past hadn't fully won. By late morning, the volunteers started filing into the room in that way people do when they want to feel useful. Someone asked if we needed more cups. Someone asked about the soup consistency. The air filled with the smell of onions cooking down, and the church, usually quiet, became loud in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. Still, I felt the edges of being treated as though I belonged to the furniture. I didn't mind the work. The work was honest. The dismissals were the thing that stuck. A man at the next table, someone who seemed to have been appointed as helper of helpers, without ever saying so, glanced at my hands like he was checking whether I would make a mistake. "You ever done this before?" he asked. I didn't answer quickly. Not because I wanted to be difficult, but because I had learned that some questions were just traps made out of curiosity. People ask because they think they need to understand you before you can be allowed to help. "Yes," I said finally. "Good," he muttered. And then he turned away as if that was the only box that needed to be checked. I kept working. When you keep working long enough, the world starts to believe you're harmless. It stops expecting you to matter. But my record didn't disappear just because I'd learned to keep my mouth closed. It lived in the way I stood. It lived in the way I moved without wasted motion. It lived in the little habits I couldn't undo, checking the door behind me once, always once, not because I expected trouble, but because I expected reality. I had been dismissed before, not in a dramatic way, not with a slur thrown like a weapon. It had been quieter than that. People had looked at me like a burden they could tolerate if they didn't have to think about it. After a while, I got used to how the country forgets. It forgets when it can't turn your service into a story it already knows. It forgets when the headlines move on. It forgets because remembering would mean admitting the truth takes more work than cheering. I didn't volunteer because I wanted gratitude. I volunteered because I knew what it felt like to be hungry for something you couldn't name. The morning continued. Soup was ladled. Bread was handed out. People thanked us with voices that ranged from polite to exhausted to silent. The room had a rhythm: when to clear plates, when to refill cups, when to watch who needed extra help without making a spectacle of it. Then, around midday, the front doors opened again. I didn't turn right away. I kept serving. Steam rose from the pot and fogged the air, and my job was to keep the flow steady. But I heard the new voice, bright, clipped, and professional. The sound of someone who'd trained herself to ask questions without sounding like she wanted answers. A woman stepped in with a press badge on a lanyard, and she carried herself like she already knew the room would cooperate. Her hair was neatly arranged, and her eyes moved quickly, scanning for the person who would be easiest to interview. She looked around like she was hunting for a moment. Renee Caldwell. I knew the name before I knew where I'd heard it. That's what recognition does when it comes from inside your bones. It doesn't ask permission. She paused near the entrance as if she were deciding whether to interrupt the volunteer flow or wait for the perfect opening. Pastor Silas noticed her first. He always did. He had that kind of awareness that comes from being responsible for people, not just schedules. "Can I help you?" he asked, walking toward her with open posture. Renee turned her attention to him. Her smile was careful. It wasn't fake, exactly, it was controlled. "I'm with the paper," she said. "Or I was. I'm freelance now. I'm doing a piece on community outreach, how churches and veterans programs overlap." I kept ladling soup, but I felt the air change. That wasn't a typical visitor. That was someone who might decide what my life meant. Pastor Silas nodded. "We welcome coverage. We're just trying to feed people." "And I appreciate that," Renee replied. "I'm not trying to turn this into a spectacle, but I think some people have stories the public hasn't heard." The way she said, "some people," made my stomach tighten. She wasn't pointing at anyone specific yet, but she was already sorting us in her mind. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who could be quoted? I heard someone behind her say, "That's the reporter, right?" There was a whisper like the room had learned a rumor overnight. Renee asked Pastor Silas if there was a veteran volunteer in charge of anything. Her tone remained polite, but her attention became sharper, like she was searching for a trophy. Pastor Silas didn't hesitate. "He's not in charge, but Walt helps with serving and with cleanup. He's steady. He's here often." He didn't say my name like it was a secret. He said it like it was normal, like I wasn't a headline waiting to be pulled out of a drawer. Renee's eyes found me. For a second, I saw something in them that didn't match her smile. It wasn't doubt. It was recognition moving faster than her control. She approached carefully, stopping a respectful distance away. Up close, I could see how tired her face looked beneath the professional makeup. It wasn't a tiredness from sleep lack. It was a tiredness from deciding over and over what truth would look like on a page. "Walt Mercer?" she asked. I looked at her. I didn't react the way some people do. No flinch, no anger showing like a reflex. I just answered honestly. "Yes." Her lips parted slightly. She swallowed once, and I noticed her throat bob. That was the first sign she was nervous. "I'm sorry," she said, and the apology sounded like it was meant for more than just interrupting my work. "I didn't know you'd be here." Pastor Silas stepped closer, watching her. "Do you know him?" Renee's gaze shifted to Pastor Silas, but she didn't look at him long. It was like her attention was stuck to me. I've seen him," she admitted. In the news, years ago. My hands paused over the soup ladle for a single breath. It wasn't that I was afraid. It was that I recognized the shape of this moment. The world loves a story with an easy moral. It loves redemption because it feels like a warm blanket. But real redemption is rarely warm. It's work. It's restraint. It's swallowing the urge to correct strangers who want to rewrite you. Was I in the news? I asked, and my voice stayed level. Renee looked down, then back up. You were. There was a segment, a man at a public event. She stopped herself. She seemed to notice that continuing would pull open something she didn't have permission to touch. Pastor Silas asked quietly, "Do you need something from him?" Renee's fingers tightened around her notepad. "I'm not here to dig, I swear. I'm doing background. But when I heard he volunteers here, She turned her notepad slightly so I could see her own handwriting. Under the lighting, the letters were sharp and controlled. She added, "I didn't want to get it wrong. I wanted to make sure he was who I thought he was." I didn't ask what she thought. I didn't ask what she'd been told. That part was always messy, always full of half-remembered quotes and edited footage. I kept my face calm. Inside, I felt something like a careful door closing. I had lived with doors closing most of my life in one form or another. Renee took a breath. "There's something I need to ask you, Walt, and I know you don't owe me anything, but could I talk to you for a few minutes?" I could have said no. I had every right to say no. But I also knew that her job was to ask questions, and that refusing too harshly would turn her into an enemy in a story she might already be writing. I didn't want to give her a scene. I wanted to give her a truth. "Okay," I said, after the line slows. A small relief passed through her expression, like she'd been bracing for conflict and found none. Pastor Silas nodded. "We'll step aside. Walt can take 5. I finished the ladle's last round before I stood. My knees complained, not loudly, just enough to remind me that age was not theoretical. My movements were measured. I didn't rush because rushing makes mistakes, and mistakes make people judge you like you've been careless all your life. We moved toward a side room that used to be classrooms. Now it held donated hygiene kits, folded blankets, and stacks of pamphlets with phone numbers for local resources. The room smelled faintly of paper and detergent. Renee opened her notepad and set it on a folding chair. She didn't sit right away. That told me she was used to interviews but not used to being nervous around the person she'd recognized. She glanced at Pastor Silas, who offered a polite smile and then stepped back out into the main hall. When the door closed, Renee's voice softened. "Thank you," she said. I watched her hands as she adjusted her pen. They hovered like she was deciding which version of me to write down. "I've been trying to follow up on that story," she continued. "It got attention. It also got twisted." I didn't move. I didn't react like I was angry. I waited because there are people who think being patient is the same thing as being weak. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. Renee hesitated. "I want you to set the record straight, just your perspective. One quote, something clear." I understood then that she wasn't asking because she cared about the truth. She was asking because the story she'd already published needed closure, and closure always sells. But she sounded human. I could see that she was wrestling with the weight of the thing she'd helped spread. So I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, a restrained one. "What parts do you think are wrong?" I asked. Her eyes flicked upward, startled that I'd asked instead of turning her request into a fight. "In the clip," she said, "they made it sound like you were angry at the officials, like you were trying to make a scene. People commented that you didn't respect authority." I let that sit. The memory rose, not the news footage, but the event itself. It had been years ago, at a ceremony where officials stood behind a podium and spoke in polished sentences. I remembered the cold outside. I remembered how the crowd waited for the moment that would look good on camera. I remembered being told where to stand, being moved aside, and being ignored until someone realized the public expected a veteran to be present. When the microphone was passed to me, it hadn't been because they respected me. It had been because they wanted a prop that would make the speech feel sincere. I remembered thinking I could either accept that role, perform gratitude on command, or refuse without making violence out of it. The country loves violence because it makes stories simple. The country loves anger because it's easier to caption. I had chosen a third option: dignity. Renee continued, "You didn't say much in the segment, you just—" She stopped again, and her pen tapped once. "You just looked at them," she said quietly. "You held yourself like you were counting something." I didn't deny it. In truth, I had been counting how many times I'd been told that my service would be honored, and how many times it had been treated like a bargaining chip. When I spoke in that moment, I hadn't been shouting. I'd spoken like someone who understands that volume doesn't make truth. I didn't want to make them the enemy, I said now, in the classroom room. I wanted the truth to be the point. Renee's shoulders lowered slightly. "So you weren't disrespectful?" Again, I didn't brag. I didn't list speeches, didn't mention units, didn't demand she admire my medals like a tax. Instead, I asked, "What did they show?" Her eyes sharpened. She understood what I meant, or maybe she realized she'd been assuming. "They showed the part where you stood up," she admitted. "Then they cut to the crowd. People laughed. Then the segment ended." That was the problem. The cut. A cut is what makes a story feel like it's about morality instead of context. A cut turns restraint into insult. I leaned back slightly, keeping my posture steady. "They cut out what came before and what came after," I said. "They needed a reaction." Renee looked down at her notes. "But what did you mean?" she asked. This time I didn't answer quickly because the answer wasn't something that fit into a single sentence that would sound good online. I chose carefully. "I meant I understood the job they were doing," I said, "and I meant they understood the job I did. But neither of us got the respect we deserved in that room." Renee's throat moved. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she didn't know what words would be fair. I watched her, and I realized something. She wasn't here because she wanted to harm me. She was here because she had been given a story and now couldn't find a way to make it complete without facing what she'd helped put on the internet. "I didn't know you'd been through that," she said finally. "I'm sorry." It would have been easy for me to tell her it didn't matter, to punish her with silence. But her apology sounded like it was trying to be honest, and honesty deserved a reply. "It's okay to be wrong," I said. "It's not okay to keep editing truth until it serves your goal." Renee flinched slightly, not from anger, from being called out. "I don't want to keep doing that," she said. "That's why I'm asking now. Here, I saw the way you volunteer. I saw how people treat you." That last line hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to being seen in the present. People could recognize the version of me from years ago, some edited clip with a reaction. But they rarely recognized me today as a man who had to get through mornings like anyone else. Renee continued, "Some volunteers act like you're just background, like you don't matter." I didn't correct her. I just let her see that she was noticing. "There's something you have," she said slowly. "It's like, when you're here, people behave better without anyone telling them to." I didn't want to be a leader, but leadership isn't always a title. Sometimes it's simply what happens when someone refuses to be ashamed. Renee flipped a page in her notebook. "Would you let me interview you again, but properly? I want to include the service part, the work you do, not just the clip." I considered it. The camera never asks permission, it always wants. But she sounded like she actually understood the difference between attention and exploitation. "Maybe," I said, "but not if you make it about me." She nodded quickly. "It wouldn't be about you. It would be about what people get wrong when they don't listen." I didn't laugh. I didn't celebrate. I watched her face as if I could read whether she would keep her promise when she needed a headline. Before I could answer, there was a commotion outside the classroom room. A volunteer called out my name again, and her voice had that edge, half embarrassment, half worry. "We've got someone here," she said. "He won't let us hand out the kits." Renee turned her head sharply. "Who is it?" The volunteer corrected herself, then swallowed. "A donor. A man. He saw Walt's picture online. He recognized him. He's making a fuss." Renee's face tightened with concern. "Of course," she muttered. I didn't move fast. I didn't want the room to think I was searching for a fight. I opened the classroom door calmly. In the main hall, a man stood near the entrance table holding a phone with the screen angled so others could see it. He was middle-aged, well-dressed in a way that suggested he wanted to be respected for being comfortable. His eyebrows were drawn tight, and his posture was built from certainty. "We're not doing this," he said loudly, as if volume could substitute for understanding. "I saw what he did. That video, he disrespected the officials. Why is he allowed here?" There were murmurs. People looked around like they weren't sure whether they were supposed to defend me or pretend I wasn't there. A few volunteers stepped back, instinctively making space for conflict. I stood in the open and watched him. He didn't recognize the man I was today. He recognized a clip and turned it into a verdict. The volunteer with the denim apron looked frightened now, her face pale. She looked at Pastor Silas as if expecting him to stop the man with authority. Pastor Silas stepped forward, calm but firm. "This is a church. We serve people. Walt helps with that. You're welcome to donate, but you don't get to accuse people based on a single—" The man cut him off. "Based on what I saw. Based on the truth. The truth is he's not worthy." Then he finally pointed at me like he needed to make sure I understood I was the target. "You! I want you out!" The room tightened. Someone clutched a shopping bag. Someone stopped folding towels. I felt the old reflex rise, an old anger, the kind that used to keep you alive. But I didn't let it take the wheel. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a soup kitchen. The correct response wasn't violence, it was dignity. I walked a few steps forward. The man's eyes followed me like he was expecting a dramatic reaction. I stopped at a respectful distance and looked at him steadily. He expected me to defend myself. He expected me to explain. He expected me to perform my worthiness like a show. I didn't explain. I didn't argue about his interpretation. I just reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small card holder. Inside was a laminated set of pages and documents, copies of my service history and emergency contact information, the kind people keep when they've learned bureaucracy is never forgiving. I didn't wave it. I didn't announce it. I just held it out. "Read it," I said. His eyes flicked to the documents and his mouth opened as if he'd expected a different kind of confrontation. Renee Caldwell stepped forward then, not to escalate but to observe. Her press badge swung slightly as she moved. "What unit served?" she asked, her tone controlled. The man stared at me like he'd been slapped, but not physically, like reality had suddenly arrived late. Pastor Silas's voice stayed steady. "Walt is here because people deserve food without conditions." The man scoffed. "Food doesn't erase—" He cut himself off because the documents weren't opinions. They were records. Then the man's phone buzzed. He glanced down. When he looked up again, his certainty had cracked. Renee's eyes narrowed slightly. "That video you saw," she said, "isn't the whole story." The man swallowed. "Are you saying I'm lying?" Renee didn't raise her voice. She just held her gaze. "I'm saying you saw a clip and treated it like a full investigation." The man's shoulders lowered a fraction, and I recognized the moment pride realizes it's about to be outmatched by proof. He looked at my hands, then at the documents again. His fingers were hesitant as he flipped a page. The paper rustled softly in the room full of careful silence. Finally, he looked up. "I didn't know," he said, and it sounded less like an apology and more like an admission of how little effort he'd put into learning. I didn't correct him into a better version of himself. I didn't demand his guilt. I simply turned back to the table and guided a volunteer's hand to where the hygiene kits needed to go. The room exhaled. Renee watched me as if she couldn't decide whether she was witnessing bravery or something quieter. Pastor Silas walked closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "She does interviews," he murmured. "But Walt doesn't collect stories. He collects time with people." Renee nodded once and then she stepped toward me. After the man left, stiff and embarrassed, moving like he expected the floor to judge him, Renee came back to the classroom with me. Her face was serious now. The interview she'd planned had already changed shape. It wasn't going to be a story about a veteran's past reaction anymore. It was going to be about dismissal, about what happens when people refuse to listen until they're forced to. Renee sat down and exhaled. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I didn't expect it to be this tense." "It's okay," I replied. "Tension happens when someone decides they know the ending." Renee looked up. "You didn't say anything in front of him. You didn't tell him off." I didn't smile. He wasn't my enemy. Renee's pen hovered over the page, but she paused instead of writing. "Why didn't you brag?" she asked. "I mean, you could. You served. You have medals. People would listen if you just—" I held up a hand slightly, not rude, but firm. "I didn't come here to be listened to," I said. Renee's eyes softened. "Then why come at all?" I thought of the soup, the smell of onions, the sound of spoons clinking against bowls, the way people sat down like their bodies had finally been allowed to rest. "I came," I said slowly, "because being fed is not about applause." Renee studied my face, and I felt her deciding what kind of truth she could actually write. She asked one more question, and it wasn't about the news clip. "Do you ever get tired," she said, "of being misunderstood?" There was a way to answer that would make for a dramatic segment. I could have admitted anger, could have thrown out phrases that would go viral. But the restraint that kept me alive also kept me honest. "I get tired of repeating the same explanation," I said. "The record should be enough. The way I act should be enough. The way I show up should be enough." Renee nodded slowly. "You're right." I didn't know if she meant it, but I knew she understood. The day continued. Volunteers still came and went. More people asked for help. More donated items arrived. Renee stayed longer than she'd said she would. She didn't walk around filming faces. She asked permission and stood aside when someone didn't want their picture taken. That was another detail people noticed, whether she wanted to turn the vulnerable into content. When lunch service ended, I helped pack leftovers into sealed containers. We carried bags out to a few people who couldn't climb the stairs. Pastor Silas brought out paper towels and set them by my elbow, like he was reminding himself that I was part of the team, not a feature. "You handled that with patience," he said. I didn't look at him like it was a compliment. I looked at him like it was just a fact. "I didn't want them to make it about me," I said. Pastor Silas shook his head slightly. "The world makes everything about people, even when it shouldn't." As we cleaned up, Renee stood near the doorway, watching from a distance. She looked thoughtful. She didn't seem to be thinking about a headline. She seemed to be thinking about responsibility. Then she walked back toward me and held out her notepad. "I wrote down a few things," she said, "but I want one line from you. Something short, something I can print without turning it into a fight." I paused because I didn't like giving quotes. Quotes are what people use to replace meaning. Still, she was trying. I could see it. I looked at her and chose a phrase that felt true without being dramatic. "Don't decide you understand me from a clip," I said. "Watch what I do when nobody's watching." Renee's eyes glistened, but she blinked it away. "I'll use that," she promised. After that, the room returned to its normal noise. Plates stacked, floors wiped, chairs folded. An hour later, Renee helped load the last boxes into a car. Before she left, she stood near the entrance and looked back at the hall. "Walt," she called softly, not with urgency, just with gratitude. "There's one thing I want to ask, about your time. You never wanted the past to be public, right?" I didn't answer that question directly. I didn't have to. I met her eyes. "I didn't ask to be misread," I said. "But I can't control what people put on the screen. I can control what I bring to this table." Renee nodded slowly. "Okay." Then she left. When she was gone, the church hall felt quieter. Not empty, just quiet in a way that meant the moment had passed without breaking anything. I stood for a few seconds by the sink and watched the last bubbles fade from the water. The day had taken my name and tested it. It had taken my past and tried to turn it into a weapon. Instead, the room had turned it into recognition, earned but not celebratory. People didn't suddenly become angels. Some stayed distant. Some still looked at me like I might be a problem. But something shifted. A volunteer who'd ignored me earlier now offered me a second helping of coffee, smiling slightly as if she hadn't realized until now that steadiness could be strength. "Thanks," she said. It was a small word, but it arrived without the condescension. It came like someone had finally seen the human behind the assumptions. Pastor Silas walked by and placed a hand on my shoulder for a moment. "You did what you always do," he said quietly. "You made room." I nodded once, then went back to the tasks that needed doing. That was the only kind of redemption I trusted. It wasn't a grand apology from the world. It wasn't an apology from strangers in the internet comments. It wasn't even a public moment with flags. It was the steady change in a room when the truth showed up without theatrics. That afternoon, I left the church with my hands clean and my mind still carrying the weight of old news. The parking lot was bright with late sun. The sky had that clean, washed look that made everything outside seem simpler than it was. I walked to my car slowly, watching other people pass, watching their faces for the signs of judgment and the signs of recognition. I wasn't expecting anything. I wasn't hunting validation. But as I got into my seat, I heard my phone buzz once. A message from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo Renee had sent, screenshots from her notes, the beginning of the draft, the line she'd written around my quote. Underneath it was a simple message. "I'll make sure they can't cut the context." I looked at it for a long moment. Then I set the phone down without replying. I didn't need to know how the public would react. I knew how dismissals worked. I also knew how dignity worked. By the time the next volunteer arrived for evening prep, I was back inside, ready to serve again. Because the truth wasn't supposed to end with a moment. The truth was supposed to be lived quietly until someone finally looked at the record they'd ignored.